privacy and fundamental rights. Why are you so focused on that aspect of the future, or why are you so worried about that personally?
Look, if it was just to control the virus, then I wouldn't be as worried. But what I have seen is that every time a freedom has been rolled back for the sake of national security, or in this case, for the sake of health, we end up losing that freedom forever, or at least for a very long time, and that it changes the way that we live our lives. So, for example, this is really concrete. If you think about what happened with 9/11, that was horrible. It was an awful terrorist incident. A lot of people died, and there were a lot of secondary impacts. But that one incident continues to impact lives around the world today. Every time you fly somewhere, you now basically are doing the equivalent of a striptease in an airport, and of course, there's not a lot of flying going around right now. But that one event actually changed the course of human society and human liberty. In Australia, we have something called a Metadata Retention Law that was passed a number of years ago, where basically ordered by the government through law to collect metadata about all the communications of people and business organizations and collect it and hold it for a period minimum of 2 years. And it was meant to be able to be accessed in the case where there was some sort of imminent terrorist threat or imminent national security incident, or something that required warrantless access to real-time information about communications from any given person or any given company around the country. But what I've seen over the last number of years is massive scope creep. So initially it was meant to be available only in these situations of national security, but then we started to see applications from I'm just trying to think of the American term, organizations that cover workers' compensation, or racing commissioners like racehorses. And, and we're talking about warrantless access to information. So if someone has committed a crime, let's say, with betting, and gambling, there are laws that would allow legal access to that kind of information. But to be able to get access without a warrant, in my view, is an erosion of liberty. And we're seeing here more and more organizations looking to access that pool of data that has now been collected without a warrant to do so, even though it was ostensibly put together to help protect us against these really serious national threats. So time and time again, as I look at areas where we've given up freedoms for the sake of the betterment of society, because nobody wants a massive terrorist attack on their homeland, or, even in their city or anywhere in the world, really. Most sane people wouldn't want that. But to give up your civil liberties if you've committed, or are suspected of committing some sort of more mundane, misdemeanor.
So what is the balance between, is this a binary proposition, do you think, that in order for us to be safe and secure, we have to give up aspects of our privacy? And you're saying, and then obviously the danger is that once we give it up, we don't get it back.
The danger is the scope creep. And what happens is that these bills get passed, and a lot of times industry organizations, and particular with the metadata in Australia, so I'll use that as an example. All of the telcos and ISPs went together and said, hang on, this legislation has so many loopholes, it's worse than Swiss cheese. You had legal organizations saying the same thing. You had civil liberties groups saying the same thing. You had giants like, Facebook and Google and Amazon and, all the other, big name social media companies all saying the same thing, that, this is bad legislation. It's not written tightly enough to be able to control who might have access. And that's the problem that I see, is that when we're in a situation like a pandemic, or we're worried about a terrorist threat, or whatever the problem du jour might be, we start to rush through legislation that may not be thought out as well as it should be, and doesn't have the checks and balances to ensure that it's used only for the purposes that it was conceived. So when it comes to something like putting in contact tracing for COVID, or having, a coronavirus vaccine repository, what we need to be really careful of is that whatever legislation or systems are put in place has the right checks and balances, so that it's only used for the purpose that it was designed for, and that it's not then turned around and used for purposes for which it was not designed, that further erode our civil liberties in ways that have nothing to do with the original concept. So, for instance, if I talk about something like a coronavirus vaccine record, and we're using that for travel purposes or for entry into various places, put aside the ethical issues of, gosh, what if you've got some other kind of medical condition that you're afraid might be exacerbated by taking this. So let's just say that we're talking about a coronavirus record, and basically it's a healthcare record that contains a lot of really, really personal information. What if there's scope creep, and suddenly that's used to decide whether you're allowed to be a visitor to a country, even if you've had, all the proper inoculations, but they're looking at all these other social things about who you might be in contact with? Or what if it goes to employment, where you've got this vaccine record that shows that you may have at some stage caught coronavirus and recovered from it, but they consider you a long-term health risk, and therefore they don't want to hire you ever, so suddenly you find that you can't get a job, so there's this whole issue of scope creep that concerns me, and it could happen in lots of different ways. And I'm not saying it's going to happen that way, but that's why I get concerned about things that are rushed out and not really thoroughly thought through, in that there's the potential for scope creep beyond the initial reason for doing something.
Do you think, to answer, whether you can answer it definitively or not, can we have both privacy and security?
I think we can, if we design in privacy and security by design. And with almost every technology that I look at, and I'll add one more, ethics, okay, because ethics is also part of this equation as well. I think if we design products and services with security, privacy, and ethics as part of the design principles, rather than slapping it on after the fact, that we actually can have the best of both worlds. But unfortunately, in today's world, security, privacy, ethics, it comes as an afterthought, not as part of the design process.